In selecting a site for the garden, I'll show you how to select the best site for a vegetable garden, and it'll be on a north-south axis. In establishing the size and layout of the garden, we'll talk about how big a garden we should build and how to lay it out, and it'll probably be about 200 square feet. In evaluating and preparing the soil, I'll show you how to evaluate the condition of your soil and how to get it ready for planting. In building raised beds, we'll learn how to build raised beds and make them especially productive with some devices that I've designed. In building season-extending tunnels, we'll build some tunnels or mini greenhouses to extend the growing season as much as 3 months. In building trellises, we'll erect a trellis system that will double our growing area. In making compost, I'll show you how to make terrific compost. It's homemade humus that does marvels for your soil. In setting up drip irrigation, we'll set up a drip irrigation system that works great while saving lots of time and money. In laying on the mulch, we'll learn how to use mulch to control our soil temperatures and eliminate weeding. In other handy garden devices, I'll show you some new garden devices that will save time and energy. In crop selection and the garden plan, I'll talk about how to select your vegetable crops and how to prepare your garden plan without overextending yourself. First question we have to ask ourselves in designing a vegetable garden is how much sun do we have on the site each day? Most vegetables need to have at least 6 hours a day. Things like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, they prefer 8. So if you don't have 6 hours of sun in your garden each day, then you probably should find another site, or you have to cut down some trees. Second question is, how are we going to point our garden? How are we going to orient it? This one is set up on our north-south axis. You can see my shadow pointing due west. The reason that's important is because if we have a plant like corn, or we have trellises with pole beans on it, we don't want them to shade out the smaller plants too much when the sun comes from the east to the west. So north-south axis is the best way to go. Next question we're going to ask is, how are we going to set this thing up? We're going to use rows, we're going to use beds. Now, I'm partial to beds for several reasons, the most important one being that rows, when you set up a garden like this in rows, you're going to have 40% of this area set up with paths. And I can't grow vegetables in paths. If I use raised beds in this garden, I'm going to get a 40% increase in productivity just because I have more room to grow vegetables. Several other reasons for raised beds too. Look at this one over here that's already fixed up. Because the soil is higher than the surrounding area around it, this raised bed will drain faster after a rain than if it wasn't raised. Because it's a raised bed, it heats up earlier in the spring than the rest of the garden does. Another reason for having a raised bed is that if you don't walk on it after it's been dug, you don't have any compaction problems. Because we've got a limited area, we're going to just water the bed and not the paths, we're going to save some water. And finally, if we double dig this bed real well, maybe a couple of years, don't walk on it, have lots of earthworms, you'll probably never have to dig this bed again. And that's why I like to use raised beds. The last question we ask in designing our vegetable garden is, how big do we want to make it? This plot here behind me is about 450 square feet, which happens to be the average of the American vegetable garden. That's probably more than most people need. If you follow the techniques we'll talk about in this program, using tunnels and trellises and intensive planting techniques, you can, in an area just this big, maybe twice this size, produce enough vegetables for a couple or a family of 3 without much trouble at all. In fact, this is 100 square feet. 2 of these beds makes 200 square feet. For a beginner, I'd recommend that as the starting size for your vegetable garden. If you want to have more, 400 square feet will probably give you enough so you can do some canning and freezing and take care of a good part of the neighborhood. Now that we've agreed we're going to use raised beds, let's talk about some of the decisions we have to make. First question is going to be, how wide do we want to have our beds? You can have a 3-foot wide bed, You can have a 4-foot wide bed. The real question is, how long is your arm? You want to be able to reach in the middle of the bed very comfortably, whether you're weeding or picking or doing any other kinds of jobs. So if you're a short person, then a 3-foot wide bed is best. If you're an average height or a taller person, then a 4-foot wide bed makes best use of your space. Next question then is, how big do we want to make our paths? How wide should they be? You don't want to make them too narrow, because you'll find you'll be very uncomfortable working in your garden. So that 18 inches is probably the minimum size of a path, or 24 inches. And sometimes you might want to even have 4 feet wide so you could get your cart comfortably in and out of your garden. I kind of like to have an alternating pattern where you got 18 inches wide, then a 4-foot wide path, then another 18-inch path, then a 4-foot wide path. And that means no matter how big your garden is, you can get your cart into every bed. How do we build these raised beds? Well, the easiest way is to simply rototill your spot, just like we have here, and then get some stakes and some string, a hammer, and lay out your beds just as the way you want them. So we'll just take and we'll measure out a 4-foot wide bed here, using our stakes and our string. Well, now we've got our beds laid out. Each bed is 4 feet wide, and we've got a path in the middle that's 4 feet wide. Couldn't be simpler to make a raised bed now, because all we have to do is take the topsoil that's in the path and throw it up onto the beds, leaving the subsoil down there where we're going to walk on, and the topsoil up where we're going to grow plants, and we have instant raised bed. Couldn't be simpler. Well, after you've put all the topsoil onto the middle of your bed, just take a rake and spread it out nice and even. Well, you try to leave the center of the bed just a little bit higher than the edges. Sort of round it off a little bit. That makes the drainage work even better. It takes care of our bed. Now let's talk about our paths. Big problem with paths is that after a rain they get muddy, and they also will grow weeds. So we want to try to avoid both those problems, and we do that with some sort of material. This is a shredded bark you can get at any nursery or garden center. We use these in our gardens. Real nice, about 1.5 inches, 2 inches. Or if you want to go the freebie route, local tree surgeon produces these wood chips. This is the product of what happens when they put their trimmings through their shredders. You can sometimes talk a tree surgeon and give you a whole truckload for free. Or if you don't have a source of wood chips, chop leaves from the fall about 4 or 5 inches thick every year to take care of the mud and the weed problem. And that's how you build a raised bed. Next, we're going to take a real careful look at the soil in our vegetable garden. The quality of our vegetables are going to be directly related to the quality of our soil. So it seems to me we should be real concerned about what's going on in our soil. I, for one, don't really care whether we have a sandy soil or a clay soil or a loamy soil. I think that the issues, as far as the quality of our soil is concerned, are the fertility, the drainage, and the depth of the soil. Let's talk about fertility first. Fertility is an issue, obviously, because that's the source of food for the plants. That's where the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium, the other micronutrients come from so that our plants can grow. Our fertility is going to be directly related probably to the humus, the amount of organic matter that we have in our soil, because that's the source of the nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium, or the NPK as we talk about. Here we have pure humus. This is compost, homemade humus, and this is peat humus, which you can buy in bags in a nursery. Notice how black it is. And that's one way we can tell how fertile our soil is, by simply looking at its color. So on these soil tests here, or these soil cores, we see that the top part, the topsoil, is darker than the subsoil in all cases. That means there's more humus in the topsoil than there is in the subsoil. The trick is to get as much humus as we can, as deeply as we can. How do we find out how fertile our soils are? Well, we can buy a soil test kit and do it ourselves, but that's not always the most accurate way. I think the best way is to go to your local county extension office and get a soil test kit from them. Cost about $3 or $4. It'll look something like this, these envelopes. And what we're going to do is we're going to collect some soil, put them in the envelope, send them away for a test, and we'll get back a full report on the fertility of our soil. Let me show you how to do a soil test. Taking a sample for a soil test isn't terribly complicated if you follow two rules. First one is, take your sample in more than one spot in the garden. 12, even 15 different places in the garden should make a collective sample from which you'll take whatever you need to put in the envelope. Second rule is, don't take your sample just from the surface of the soil. Go down about 4-6 inches with a trowel, take a teaspoon or a tablespoon, take about that much, put it in a little can, take your 8, 10, 12, 15 samples, let it sit overnight and dry out a little bit, mix it up, take a half a cup out, put it in your envelope, mail it off. In about 3 or 4 weeks, you'll get back a full report. And that's all there is to taking a soil sample. Now let's look at drainage. Why do we worry about drainage? Well, if we have a soil that doesn't drain very well and holds water for a long time, that prevents oxygen from getting to the roots of the plants, and that prevents the plants from being healthy. It's as simple as that. So we want to find a way to check out the drainage of our soil. A lot of people will check the type of soil. They'll say clay soil, bad drainage. Sandy soil, good drainage. That's not the way to look at it. Interestingly enough, the issue is the color of the soil, not what type of soil it is. If you have a brown soil like this, it's going to drain well. If you have a gray soil like this, it's not likely to drain very well. Doesn't matter whether it's clay or sand, it's the color. And the color is related to how much iron is in the soil. If you have a lot of iron, it'll be brown. If you don't have much, it'll be gray. So over here we have a sandy soil, but it's gray, which will probably mean that it won't drain very well. Over there we have a clay soil, but look at it, it's brown. It'll drain pretty well. So that's the first way we'll check, and we'll look and see what the color of our soil is, and we'll have a pretty good, quick idea about whether we have any problems. But there's another way we can check that. There's a test we can use. Let me show you how to do it. Another way to check your drainage is to dig a hole big enough to hold a gallon can that's had the bottom taken out of it. Take that can and set it in the hole and fill it up with water, let it drain out. Then let the ground sit for a whole day and come back a day later and fill it up again. It's that second filling that's important. Then you want to time how long it takes for the can to drain. If it takes more than 6 hours, you have a drainage problem you're going to have to do something about. If it takes less than 6 hours, you're probably okay. And that's all there is to checking the drainage. When you get your soil test report back, the first thing we want to check is to see what the pH reading is. It's going to be a number, something like 6.2, 5.8, 7.1. That number is telling you how acidic or alkaline your soil is on a scale from 0, which is very acidic, up to 14, which is very alkaline, with 7 being neutral or in the middle. In a vegetable garden, ideally you want to have a pH reading of about 6.0 to 6.5, or slightly acidic. The reason that that's important is because that's the area where we can get the most nutrient transfer from the soil into the roots of the plants. If our reading comes in and it's not within that 6.0 or 6.5 range, then we're going to have to do something to change the pH reading of our soil. And there are two ways we can do it. If we're too alkaline, that is maybe having a reading of, say, 7.2, then we're going to use something like this, some sulfur, which buy in any garden center. Looks like that. And you're going to add this sulfur to your soil to bring the reading down from 7.2 to the 6.5 that you desire. If your reading is down below 6.0, let's say it's 5.8, it's quite acidic, then the answer there is we're going to add some lime, ground limestone to our soil. Looks like that. In both cases, your report's going to tell you how much you should use to make your adjustment, and they'll give you the amount in pounds. One 1-pound coffee can will hold 3 pounds of limestone. As a matter of fact, it also holds 3 pounds of sulfur. So you can use a 1-pound coffee can as your measure of how much you need to put on your garden. In both cases, whether it be sulfur or with limestone, they don't take effect immediately. So that you'd really be best putting this on in the fall, because neither of them really begin to change the pH of your soil for maybe 3, 4, 5 months. If you're in the springtime, you haven't had a chance to do a soil test, and you're in a rush, and you have especially an acidic problem, you want to move your pH reading up from 5.0 up to 6.0, then wood ashes is a way to do it pretty quickly. Just don't put too much on, because you could get a potassium problem at the same time. In any case, you'll probably want to do this every year for a couple of years, just to make sure that you have your pH level up to where you want to be the best, around 6.0, 6.5. Next thing you're going to get from your soil test report is the status of the major nutrients in your soil. That's the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the potassium. NPK, as it's referred to on the fertilizer bags. You're going to have a good report if all three of those nutrients are in balance. That is, the relative amount of each is about the same. You're going to have a bad report if any one of those are way out of proportion to the other two. If you do have that situation, the test report's going to tell you what to do. It'll tell you what to add to your soil, how much. Follow those instructions and you'll be able to start your garden. Whether it's a good report or a bad report, though, as far as I'm concerned, there's 2 or 3 things we should do every year to maintain the fertility of our soil. Let me show you what I do. I build my soil's fertility with at least 3 steps. First, I add earthworms to my garden almost every year. Among other valuable services, earthworms will produce their weight in fertilizer every single day. In a bed this size, that means that about 50 pounds of free fertilizer is being produced each year. If you don't average 3 or 4 earthworms in each shovelful of topsoil, you could use some earthworms as well. So spread them around when you introduce them. Don't just plunk them into one spot. Next, I deal with the humus content of my soil. A good vegetable garden soil should have a minimum of 5% humus or organic matter in it. I solve that problem by adding 5% every year. It turns out that 1-inch layer of compost or some compost substitute happens to equal 5% of that first 12 inches of your garden soil. If you don't have compost, you can buy peat humus, looks like this, and mix it with this dried cow manure, about 4 to 1. You'll have the same thing. Again, though, you want to put on about 1 inch every year. Or you can use peat moss, looks like this. It's different than peat humus. Mix your peat moss with your dried cow manure, again about 4 to 1. But because peat moss is pretty acidic, you want to also add some lime to this mixture. Again, though, put on that inch. By the way, I should point out that when you put this organic material on your bed, you're also solving that drainage problem you might have had. The only really good way to solve a drainage problem is by adding lots of organic material to your soil. After adding some organic material, I like to add some rock powders as well. This is rock phosphate. It produces phosphorus, and this is green sand. It produces potassium. What's attractive about these rock powders is they break down very, very slowly. You only have to add about 10 pounds every 2 years to give your plants all the potassium and phosphorus they need. That's about 3 coffee cans full in a bed this size. Why do we have to dig our garden in the first place? There's really 3 good reasons. We want to get oxygen down the soil, we want to improve the drainage, and we're going to reduce the compaction, which prevents the roots from getting food to the plants. Let's talk a little bit about digging the garden. One way to dig our garden is with a rotary tiller. Most tillers will get down about 6 or 8 inches, but they don't really get down there and break up your subsoil. No matter what kind of soil you have, clay or sandy, be careful never to over-till the soil, because if you till too much, you can break up some of the finer particles in the soil structure and you're going to cause some drainage problems later. Also, you should never rotor-till your soil when it's real wet. Again, you're going to mess up your soil structure. If you've got bad soil to start off with, perhaps a more thorough way to dig your garden is with what's called double digging. Not very complicated, but it's kind of hard work. First, we dig a trench like this, removing the topsoil. Then we're going to break up that subsoil with this fork, maybe at the same time working in some compost and some lime. We finish that, we step back a few steps, take the topsoil, put it over on top of the subsoil, and do those steps over and over again until we finish our bed. When you double dig a bed like this, you're going to end up with about 12 to 15 inches of well-aerated soil without having mixed the subsoil with the topsoil. It's a real good way to dig a garden. If you do this real well, maybe 2 years in a row, you're going to end up with a bed that has soil that is so fluffy and so well dug that you'll probably never have to dig it again, or at least you won't have to double dig it again. If you do have real good garden soil, this tool will probably do the job for you. It's called the U-bar digger. It's real easy to use, especially handy for people with a bad back. Well, we fixed our soil's fertility. It's now well drained and it's deep. Should have a real quality soil producing good eating all season long. Raised beds are great, but I think boxed raised beds are even better for a couple reasons. First of all, when you got a raised bed that doesn't have a box around it, you're always having to dress up the sides because the rain tends to erode it down. And I'm always looking for ways to save from work. Perhaps the best reason for a boxed raised bed is being able to have these foundations attached on the inside of the boards, but at 4-foot intervals. These foundations are used to hold trellises, tunnels, other devices in the garden we'll talk about later. You can see I use piece of PVC pipe. It's 1.5 inches in diameter, 12 inches long. I strap it on the inside of the board with 2 pieces of plumbing strap. You can get it in any hardware store. Use nails, screws, however you want to attach them. And you put the PVC pipe so it's just flush with the top of your board. You notice I'm using a pretty heavy-duty piece of wood here. I think that if you're going to build a box raised bed, you may as well have one that lasts for a little while. This is 2 by 8-inch pressure-treated plank. You build a box with this stuff, and you're going to have a raised bed that'll last you for 15 or 20 years. Let me give you a couple tips on how to build these beds. First of all, when you make your raised bed, pile your dirt right in the middle so you have some room on the sides to put the lumber down. And wherever you're going to have a foundation, you'll dig a little hole deeper than the level of the soil so that it fits in nice. When you put your box together, you try to keep it level as you can anyway. It makes the trellises look neater. Finally, when you put your dirt back in and level it all off, try to keep the level of your soil about 2 inches below the top of the bed. The reason for that is that when you put compost and mulch and other things in your garden, you don't want to worry about having stuff drop inside these foundations, and you don't want stuff falling outside the bed. One of the best ways to get the maximum productivity from a vegetable garden is to be able to extend our growing season from early spring and late on to the fall. And I think the best way to do that is building what I call a plastic tunnel. We'll use those foundations that we just put on the inside of our boxed raised bed to hold the ends of this flexible plastic pipe. Is about 1 inch in diameter, and they're about 8 feet long. That gives us a rib that we can use that's in the middle going to be roughly 2 feet high, so that's going to be able to handle any size plant we have. All I'm going to do is I'm going to stretch a bunch of these ribs down the end of the bed, and I'm going to lay clear plastic film over the top, and I'm going to have a mini greenhouse on this bed. Let me put the rest of the ribs in. Next thing we want to do is to give these ribs some vertical stability and also give some stability to the plastic panels. I've got 3 nails tapped into the end of my bed here, and I'm going to put 3 lines of string around each of the ribs just like this, 2 on the sides and 1 on the top. Now we have a real solid structure under which to lay these panels. What I've got here is a panel of clear plastic, 4 mil, preferably 6 mil is best, attached to a 1x2 furring strip with a staple gun. These furring strips are about 5 feet long, so that means I've got at least a 6-inch overlap on either side of my ribs, so when I lay these on the tunnel, I'm going to have a good coverage and not any worry about the panels blowing off. What I'm going to do here then is simply line it up between the 2 ribs and just lay that over like so. Then I'll put all of my panels on, and I'll come back and I'll dress it up and make it look pretty and show you how to hold it down. Now we've covered our tunnel, you can see that their end piece here is designed a little bit different than the middle pieces. I've got to worry about covering the end, so instead of having 2, I have 3 pieces of furring strip to attach to the plastic. I overlap the inside by 6 inches, but the end sticks out about 2.5 feet, so I can roll it down here and cover the front. I take my excess and I fold it in like that. It doesn't look very pretty, but it works just fine. Now we got to worry about the wind. 2 ways we can hold these down. One way is to take these homemade hairpins made from old coat hangers and simply just push them right through the plastic and over the wood down into the ground. The other way, of course, is we can just use bricks and put bricks on each end of all the furring strips. We've got one more step we've got to worry about before we finish our tunnel. If we didn't do anything else to this tunnel, on a sunny day, the temperature in there would get over 100 degrees real fast. So we're going to actually cut slits on the top of the plastic on both sides of the tunnel. The slits will be about 4 inches apart, maybe about 6 inches long, We'll just cut them down with this knife, just like so, the length of the tunnel. Of course, one of the tricks is to be careful not to cut the string. I should make one final point too, and that is why I use these individual panels instead of having one great big piece of plastic. I think when you have a garden like this, you'll tend to use the garden in little sections. You won't go in there and work on the entire bed. And so I like to be able to just go into the middle of my garden, maybe do a little bit of tending of my transplants, water something, close it off, and not have to worry about taking it all apart. This kind of a tunnel is going to add a month and a half to your spring growing season. It's going to add a month and a half to your fall growing season. That's 3 more months. I think it's really worth the effort. Another way to increase the productivity of our garden is to grow vegetables vertical as well as flat on the soil. Got to find a device to do that. You can get some commercial ones like this pea fence or this tomato cage. And I expect most of us have had some experience in trying to find a way to put a pole down the ground far enough so that come August, when they're filled with tomatoes, next storm just doesn't knock it over. And this foundation we're looking at is designed to solve that problem. All we have to do is get a piece of rigid PVC pipe like this, 8 foot long, 1 inch in diameter. Just set that into the foundation, move down the line, put another one in the foundation, and we got the basis for a perfect trellis. Then what we do is we take some 1x2 furring strips, just like we did with our tunnels, and instead of adding plastic, we're going to put this netting on using a staple gun, drill some holes in the end of the pieces of wood, and then we use some 1/4 inch bolts, drill some holes in our PVC pipe. Holes are about 5/8, so there's lots of room for the bolt. And we just put these in the holes. And you'll notice I've got 2 sets of holes at the top and the bottom of each of our pipes. That's so I can alternate my panels on down the line. And then when I want to secure this, all I'm going to do is attach a butterfly nut at the end. Real easy to put on and real easy to take off. This is a real strong netting. It's 7 inches across so that you can pick things right through it. It's made out of nylon. It'll last about 5 or 6 years. You can get it in almost any gardening catalog. It's strong enough so it'll hold anything. Tomatoes, melons, winter squashes. Now look what we have. We've got a bed that's got 100 square foot of growing area. When we finish this trellis, we're going to add another 175 square feet. For something that only takes about 15 or 20 minutes to rig, we'll probably get a 50% increase in productivity from this one bed alone. I think that's a pretty nice device. Homemade compost offers an excellent nitrogen fertilizer for vegetables. But perhaps more important, this stuff has enormous water holding capacity, which really improves the garden's ability to deal with drought in the middle of the summer. On top of that, it helps to reduce certain kinds of disease problems, and this homemade humus is basically free. Making compost is a very simple process. Now, some books and articles will make a big deal of using precise formulas and ratios of materials in building a pile. Now, all of those formulas will produce compost all right, but they're a bit too complicated for my taste. After all, compost is nothing more than the product of the natural decomposition of organic materials. It happens in the woods every day. There are 2 ways to make compost: the passive method and the active method. The passive method is simple. You make a pile of stuff and let it sit and decompose for a few years. This approach works, but it's pretty slow in producing the final product. The active method requires that you turn the pile or mix it up a few times during the year so the decomposition process works faster. I prefer the active method. Now, you really don't need a bin to make good compost. The bin simply keeps things neat and helps keep the backyard looking more attractive. Compost needs 4 things for good decomposition. First, we need the carbon material. That's the dry stuff, like leaves or straw. Then we need nitrogen. That's the green stuff. Grass clippings, weeds, kitchen waste. Then we need some oxygen. Get that from the air when we build the pile or later when we turn the pile. And finally, we need some water, and that'll come from the leaves that they've been sitting out in the weather, but if they're dry, then you'll probably have to add some water as you build your pile. Some folks like to add some rock powders to their pile. They'll put in rock phosphate for phosphorus, some green sand for potassium. But I kind of think that's frosting on the cake. Notice that I've been building this pile by simply throwing the various materials on so that they get mixed up somewhat. There's really no magic formula. An active compost pile needs to have more carbon material, that's the straw and the leaves, than nitrogen material, the grass clippings and such. Now, many gardening books are going to recommend a ratio of about 30-to-1, carbon to nitrogen. But my experience indicates that you can cut that ratio way down to even 10-to-1 if you turn the pile once in a while, at least monthly. Be especially careful never to use any meat products or bones or grease in your compost pile because they're going to attract rodents and they can cause the pile to start to smell. In fact, a compost pile should never smell bad. If it does, you've probably put too much nitrogen material or green stuff in it. Remember how a pile of fresh grass clippings smells after sitting in the sun for a few days. Now, if a pile does smell bad, go ahead and add more carbon material, the straw or the dried leaves. You can tell your compost pile is working by simply sticking your fist into the middle about a foot or so. If it's uncomfortably warm, pile's working just fine. The center of a good compost pile will go up to 150 degrees. If the pile's not working, that means you have to mix in some nitrogen material, the green stuff, grass clippings, for example. Then the pile will be working again. You don't need a shredder to make good compost, but it can be a big help. Everything composts faster when it's shredded. Chopped leaves compost better than whole leaves. You can chop them up with your lawnmower, or you can use a shredder. Hedge and shrub clippings compost much better if they're shredded first. In fact, if you don't have a shredder, I suggest you avoid having any sticks in your compost pile at all. When I finish a compost pile, I like to cover it with something to keep the rain from soaking it and cooling it. I use polyethylene film, and I staple some pieces of wood on each end, keep the wind from blowing it away. This is particularly important in the wintertime to keep the rain from leaching out those nutrients that are water-soluble, like nitrogen. I also keep track of my compost pile temperature, so when it gets down to about 100 degrees, I know it's time to turn the pile again. Now, you don't have to be that precise unless you're looking for finished compost very quickly. If you are, and you turn this pile every 2 days, you'll have finished compost in about 3 weeks. If we need an inch of compost over our entire garden each year, how much compost are we going to need? One way to figure it is a 1-inch layer of compost over 200 square feet requires 16 cubic feet of compost. I just happen to have here 16 cubic feet. 1 foot high, 4 feet deep, 4 foot across. It also turns out that if we filled this bin, which is 3 feet high, 4 foot across and 4 foot deep, right to the very top with composting materials, we would produce about 16 cubic feet of compost. Now, compost is easy to make, it does wonderful things for your soil, and the price is right. There are a number of different ways we can water a vegetable garden. Most people probably use a garden hose and a sprinkler or a sprayer of this kind. That's okay, except that you waste a lot of water and it also takes a lot of time. Of course, our old friend, the sprinkling can, is great for seedlings, but not terribly practical for watering a whole vegetable garden. My favorite tool for that job is what's called a drip irrigation system. It looks something like this. It's been around in commercial agriculture for many years, and now we can get them in a nursery or a garden center or a mail order. They come in different forms. This is called an emitter system. It's a flexible pipe that's got these little valves called emitters about every 20 inches, and they're designed to let water into the soil just a drop at a time, very slowly. And as the water accumulates in the soil, it spreads and spreads and spreads, so that after about 40 minutes, 50 minutes maybe, the entire bed is watered, but there's no water been put on the leaves of the plants. We have less disease problems, and we have hardly any waste of water at all. In fact, these systems will probably save 30% of the water that you would normally use if you use an overhead system. Another approach to drip irrigation, which I like, is it's called a porous hose. This is made out of recycled automobile tires, and it sweats the entire length of the hose. It's got billions and billions of little pores in it. Real tough. We'll leave it out all winter long. This will last 25 years. Beauty of it is just set it up in your garden like this, and you're going to end up saving water. If you put a timer on the end of it, you'll save all kinds of time. And maybe most important is research has shown that vegetables grown with a drip irrigation system are about 30% more productive than vegetables that are grown with an overhead system. Drip systems also reduce compaction, and they cool the soil in the summertime, which is really great. As you see, I've laid this thing out so it's only about 2 feet apart. That way, for my 4-foot bed, I've got complete coverage. Usually a foot on either side is going to be the normal coverage for a drip system. Hook it up to your hose with a timer. This is one of the mechanical ones, just like the one in your kitchen. Turn it on, say 30 minutes. Your drip system's working. And look at this. Real slow drop at a time. That's why I like drip irrigation. I don't think there's a vegetable garden in the world that shouldn't use mulch. It saves water and eliminates weeding. I make a distinction between mulches that cool the soil and mulches that warm the soil. The most common way to warm the soil is black plastic film. You lay it out in the spring, maybe about 4 weeks before your last frost date, and it's going to heat up the soil anywhere from 6 to 8 degrees higher than surrounding area. That means you can plant vegetables anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks earlier than your neighbors can. It also keeps the soil wet, avoids evaporation, eliminates those weeds, avoids compaction, does a lot of good things except one problem. It doesn't have any holes in it except for where the plants are, so it doesn't let rain through. You can solve that problem by putting your drip irrigation system underneath your black plastic mulch. That way you have your value of your mulch as well as getting water in. There's another way though, and that is to put holes in the black plastic. In fact, you can buy in the market now black plastic mulch that has holes already put in it. Millions and millions of little perforations in this stuff. They've got woven materials, look like this. Still warm the soil 6 to 8 degrees, but also let the rain through. I found a way to put the holes in myself. I just take regular black plastic, fold it up between 2 boards that have some holes in them, take a sharp knife, cut the holes just 2/3 of the way around. So that way I have flaps, not really holes. And as you can see, I then have a mulch that will still warm my soil, but the rain can come through. Using this black plastic mulch is really not very difficult. Put the plants in simply by cutting an X in the mulch, taking a little trowel and making a hole for your seedling, and then you can just pop that seedling right in there, just as slick as can be. Turns out that research has shown that plants that are planted in black plastic are going to be healthier and more productive than plants that don't use black plastic. So it's pretty good stuff. It's going to be a point, though, that I'm not going to want to keep warming my soil. Sometime in July, I'm going to want to start cooling the soil. I keep track of that using a soil thermometer. We have 2 different models here. They both work just fine, but I happen to like this one because I can read it standing up. I don't have to get down on my hands and knees. When that thermometer hits about 65, 70 degrees, then that's the time I'm going to want to start cooling my soil, so I'm going to look for a cooling mulch. Almost any organic material is going to serve well as a cooling mulch. Straw, hay, even chopped leaves. All you do is take your straw or your organic material and you put it around all the plants in your garden about 4 to 6 inches deep, right over the top of the black plastic. In about a day, the soil around those plants is going to be 8 to 12 degrees cooler than if they didn't have that mulch. Throughout the summer, I'm going to watch my soil temperatures, and in the fall, when things cool off, and my soil thermometer says around 60 degrees, then I'm going to take my organic material off, my cooling mulches. There's my black plastic, ready to do its warming thing again, and I'm going to get maybe 3 or 4 weeks of season out of my garden that my neighbors aren't going to get because they don't use this system. So we're going to use black plastic in the spring, organic or cooling mulch in the summer, black plastic again in the fall. Save water, no weeds, more productive vegetables. That's a good reason for using mulch. One of the fun things about vegetable gardening is thinking up new ways to save time or save space or produce a better tomato. We'd like to show you some devices that you might find interesting and helpful and might save you a little time, and you might want to use them in your own garden. This device is called a coal frame. You can buy a kit or you can make one yourself. If you don't want to use tunnels, this is a real good way to start your seedlings in the spring, or at least harden them off and get them ready so they don't get too frostbitten when you put them out into the garden. Another real helpful tool is this grow light platform. Again, you can get this commercially or you can make one yourself. It's really a wonderful way to start seedlings. Make sure that you have plants not only in the springtime but available all through the whole year. This is a simple plank I use as a standing board so that I don't ever have to stand on the soil directly to avoid the compaction problems that would create. This little tool is something my dad designed. It's called a planting compass. It adjusts with this little butterfly nut, and I can use it to measure the distance between my plants. So when I'm putting out seedlings, this is a real quick way to figure out how I can get them as close as possible without being too close. These little devices I call planting squares. They're used to put seeds in a garden in a real intensive fashion, that is as close as possible but not too close. One is set up for 2-inch spacing, the other one's set up for 3-inch spacing. You can set up any way you want. I find them real handy. Another way to use the ribs on the tunnels is to replace the clear plastic with bird netting. Use this over your strawberry patch and never again will those birds get any of your berries. For those of you who want lettuce in the summer, these same ribs for the tunnels can be used with a shading material like fleece or cheesecloth, and it gives your lettuce protection from the sun and allows you to grow it all season in most parts of the country. Don't forget to use lots of organic mulch to keep that soil temperature down. We'll talk about this rig in another program, but I wanted to show you a way to grow 12 apple trees in a very small space. I call it an orchard fence. You can have 4 different varieties on this fence, giving you fresh apples from late August to the first frost. This potting shed represents a place to store your tools, but also serves another function. That gives you a place to grow some plants. I think it's a nice design. You could probably think of 12 more things yourself, but we hope these have given you some ideas to maybe save you some time and some space. Let's talk about planning this vegetable garden. We spent all this time building this nice facility. How do we choose which vegetables to put in? You pick up any seed catalog and you're going to find 50 different vegetables to choose from. It's real easy to get carried away. So we got to figure out a way, how do we make a choice? Numbers are important. If you only have 10 vegetables in your garden at any one time, that's a real easy management task. But you move up and have, say, 20 vegetables in your garden at one time, then things get a little bit more complicated. It's doable, but you got to remember, every vegetable has its own watering requirements, its own feeding requirements, its own pest problems. So every single time you add another vegetable to your list, you're complicating your growing season. If you're a beginning gardener and you stick 30 vegetables in your garden at one time, I'm suggesting you're working your way towards disaster. So be conservative that first year. I think the best way is to pick something you like. And therefore, you should make a list of those vegetables that your family likes to eat best. Pick the top 10. Of course, you got to choose vegetables you can grow. If you happen to be into avocados and you live in Michigan, I'm afraid you're out of luck. Let's start with those 10 vegetables that everybody likes to eat, and then you can add 5 or 10 more to round out your list. I like to divide my list between cool weather vegetables and warm weather vegetables. Cool weather vegetables are things like cabbages, broccoli, onions, carrots, those kinds of things. Warm weather crops, we mean tomatoes, peppers, summer squash, pole beans. By keeping your list in roughly half between cool weather and warm weather vegetables, that'll mean that you're going to have something in your garden throughout the entire growing season, giving you maximum productivity for that patch. There's other ways you can choose your vegetables. You can pick those vegetables that have the most nutrition. Then we're talking about broccoli, green peppers, peas, and spinach. Or maybe you're looking for productivity, so you want to find those vegetables that have the most production per square foot. Then we're talking steak tomatoes, pole beans, peppers, and summer squash. Or maybe you're watching the family budget and you want to grow those vegetables that have the most value. So then we're talking about tomatoes, summer squash, bunching onions, and leaf lettuce. No matter how you choose, just make sure that you pick no more than 15 or 20 vegetables that first year. You sure don't want to bite off more than you can chew. After choosing your crops, the next thing we have to do is to determine two very important dates. We need to know the date of our last expected frost in the spring and the date we can expect our first frost in the fall. For a lot of gardeners, that makes up the whole growing season. But we've learned that if we use a plastic tunnel, we can extend our season a month, month and a half on both ends. So for us, we need to know those dates for planning our garden schedule. It'll tell us when we put our tunnels out. It'll tell us when we can plant our peas, when we can put our cabbages out, when we can put the tomatoes in the garden, when we can start our seedlings for next fall. If you don't know those dates, all you have to do is call your local county extension office. They'll give it to you right away. There's some other questions we need to answer, things about when do you water your peppers, when do you fertilize the cucumbers, how much do you fertilize, those kinds of things we're not going to be able to answer in this program. So we've produced two other video programs, one dealing with cool weather vegetables and the other one with warm weather vegetables. We try to answer those kinds of questions there. Next thing we need to do is figure out how much of each vegetable we want to put in our garden this year. We want to have enough for the family, but we don't need enough for the whole neighborhood. We've all heard the stories of the giant zucchinis taking over small towns sometime in August. Most seed packets are going to come with far more seeds in them than we really need. This cabbage pack, for example, we're going to have probably 100, 120 seeds. Look at that. And we sure don't need to have 100 cabbages this season. So the way you handle that problem is find yourself a good gardening book. Look up a chart. It'll tell you the productivity of each vegetable per square foot in the bed. And that should answer your questions. When you're in doubt, be conservative, and then you'll be sure. Another thing to think about is whether we're going to use direct seeding or seedlings in our garden. The issue is pretty clear as far as I'm concerned. I think that any time you have a vegetable that you can raise as a seedling, that's how it should go in the garden. The reason for that is while these seedlings are growing on my windowsill or under my lights, 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks, there's other things growing in my vegetable garden. So I'm getting the most efficient use of that space by using seedlings. Another question is whether I should grow my own seedlings or whether I can buy them from the nursery. Well, there's advantages and disadvantages. If you grow your own seedlings, you're going to have a lot more choice in terms of the types of varieties you can get. You're going to have them available when you want them. And in the long run, they're going to be cheaper. If you buy them from the nursery, though, you're going to get a variety you know is going to work in your area, and you're going to save some time. Another question is, what happens when I plant my cabbage seedlings and I use about 20 seeds, and I've got 80 seeds left over? Can I use those again? Well, the answer is yes. All you do is you fold up your packet as tight as you can, put it in an airtight jar like a mayonnaise jar or pickle jar, stick it in the back of your refrigerator, and you can use those seeds again next year. In fact, a lot of the seeds in your vegetable garden you can use for 3 years before they're not any good anymore. So my feeling is when you can use seedlings, if you have a little extra time, learn how to grow your own. I guess the last issue in our plan is whether we're going to have a map of our garden or a sketch of our garden or not. Some people like to take a piece of graph paper and make a real detailed drawing of all their plans, where they're going to plant each of their vegetables throughout the whole season. Well, I think that a real complicated sketch isn't necessary. I suggest you start off with just a very simple sketch of what you're going to have for your spring planting. That is, all the crops that are going to go in first. And after that, you're going to plant your plants where you have open space. Because, for example, look at this. I've got spinach here in the spring. I'm going to put mid-season cabbage in there around the middle of June. I'm going to have late lettuce in there in September. And if I kept track of all of the different crops I'm going to have, 2 and 3 different crops in the same space, my map's going to get pretty complicated. So I think for beginners, if you set out a sketch of your first spring planting, you'll be fine. There's one cardinal rule I'd like to finish up with, and that is never plant the same vegetable in the same spot in your garden 2 years in a row. What you need to do is rotate your crops from one bed to another or one spot to another every year so that you can avoid any buildup of disease or insect problems. This rotation is real easy if you just keep a simple record of where you put your crops each year, so that this year I had my tomatoes in this bed. I know that I want to put them over here next year. Well, that about does it. We've showed you how to design a garden, how to build one, how to plan one. You should be ready now to take those seeds and get that vegetable patch going. Any good gardener will tell you that the basic design of your vegetable garden and the preparation of the soil in that vegetable garden are probably the two most important things you'll ever do in that garden. And that's what we've been talking about in this program. We've showed you how to build raised beds, how to rig a drip irrigation system. We've encouraged you to use lots of mulch. Showed you how to build a tunnel system that can extend your growing maybe as much as 3 months during the year. And how to build a trellis system that can virtually double your growing area. And most important, we've strongly encouraged you to put as much humus in that soil as you possibly can. If you do all those things, you should have as good a vegetable garden as you possibly could imagine, and not break your back doing it. And best of all, at the end of the day, you can sit back and watch your vegetables grow.